Welcome to the Mad in America podcast, your source for science, psychiatry, and social justice.
Piers Gooding is a Mozilla Foundation Fellow and researcher at the Melbourne Social Equity Institute at the University of Melbourne Law School. His main research interests are disability law and policy, international human rights law, the law and politics of mental health, and empirical legal research. Dr. Gooding describes his scholarship as an interdisciplinary undertaking that blends theoretical inquiry with applied qualitative research at the local, national, and international levels. He has collaborated with the UN Special Rapporteur for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the World Psychiatric Association on recommendations for alternatives to coercion in mental health. In this interview, he discusses his journey pursuing a human rights agenda in mental health and the conceptual and practical difficulties facing those trying to intervene upon entrenched practices of institutional care. He then talks about the connection between his long-standing work to prevent coercion in mental health and the digital, data-driven direction taken by the field as a whole. He elaborates the regulatory and ethical issues he has uncovered at the intersection of mental health services and data-driven technologies, and gestures at emerging methods of algorithmic accountability for addressing some of these issues. So, Dr. Gooding, you have broad theoretical and interdisciplinary interests. Why don't you tell our readership a little bit about your background and how you got started working in this field?
Sure. So I grew up in Melbourne, Australia, and I suppose through formative experience with a family member experiencing a pretty serious crises and entering mental health services, I gained an interest in the politics of mental health. My first degree is actually in history and cultural studies, and I think through that degree, I was able to investigate some elements of the mental health services that I was encountering at the time through a historical lens, looking at the social and political conditions that gave rise to mental health services as they are. When I was a kid, I grew up not far down the road from a large-scale Victorian-era mental asylum or psychiatric asylum or mental hygiene institution. It had various names through the 19th and 20th century, but I was fascinated by the role that institution had in the city, and I investigated its origins and its changing relationship to the city and its very utopian ideals in the beginning to reflect a civilized society and its degradation into a place of exclusion, segregation, and violence really against people with disabilities. And I mean, that continued into my lifetime when I was a 12-year-old kid. The last remaining residences in that institution burnt down, and 6 men with intellectual disabilities who were in a locked ward were killed. I remember as a kid learning about one of the men who hadn't received a single visitor in his 30 years of life after being deposited in the institution as a baby. So I think that kind of really grim history sparked my interest in the broader cultural and social and political place that psychiatric institutions and psychiatry more broadly and psychology have in Western history. Through my degree, I was able to gain a role as a research officer at an advocacy organisation for family members of people in the mental health services, and I was undertaking policy-based research and law reform-focused work, and I was able to then interact with academics who were working in this space, and I was invited to do a PhD in a law faculty at Monash University. Through that work, I was able to focus on what was a major development at the time in the mental health world, and that is the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which essentially came into force the year before I started my PhD. In that year prior to my PhD thesis, I actually took something of a break from work and traveled all around the US, trying to meet with as many activists and advocates and interesting thinkers in the mental health space as I could. And through that, I was able to engage with some really tremendous activists and thinkers, including the likes of Leah Harris and Judy Chamberlain, and people who are regulars in the Mad in America website. And that really gave me a sense of some of the global political struggles and work that was going on to try to address some of the harms that have occurred in mental health systems. I was also lucky enough to be at a lecture that was presented in Melbourne, in which a visiting human rights lawyer from New York City was joining us by the name of Tina Minkovitz, Esquire. And through Tina's presentation on the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, I was introduced to this idea of supported decision-making. And supported decision-making really spoke to me as an idea that would challenge, I think, some of the broad assumptions that seem to pervade social and cultural responses to mental health crisis, to personal and emotional states of extreme distress. By reframing the issue as one of looking at the conditions in which a person lives and assisting them to realise their will, their preferences, and their broader kind of rights related to housing, related to all the kind of social and economic things that make up a good life. And not to sort of diminish or overpower that person in the process. And so I set to focusing my PhD on this idea of supported decision-making and this question of what the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities meant for mental health legislation. You know, the same legislation that was in operation when that asylum on the hill by my childhood home was in its final stages. And I was very interested in the kind of history of policy and law leading up to that moment of new forms of law and policy that centered the apparent rights of people in crisis, but which in practice appeared to establish different standards and different rights for those individuals, what in my view were discriminatory exceptions for someone by virtue of being diagnosed with mental illness, to use the terminology. It was really interesting. At one point I was concerned that I wouldn't be able to conduct a PhD in a law faculty because I didn't have a law degree. I'm not a lawyer. And I was at a disability rights conference here in Melbourne. And one of the speakers was a fellow named Professor Ron McCallum, who ended up being the first chair for the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is the UN advisory body that essentially provides interpretive guidance about how to apply the convention. Ron is a sort of famed lawyer here in Australia, a Labor lawyer, grew up in a working class suburb here in my city. And I managed to find him in a quiet moment in the conference and asked him whether he thought it was a good idea for someone who doesn't have a law degree to do a PhD in a law faculty concerning the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And interestingly, he said, historians make the best lawyers because they understand the context in which a law was written. And that's always really stuck with me and driven my work insofar as I'm interested in the social and political context in which laws are applied. So hence I consider myself a socio-legal studies or socio-legal scholar.
Yeah, so I find it really unique about your work that you're in this socio-historical realm, but there's also sort of a unique combination, I think, of lived experience perspective, like the most micro possible level, right? All the way sort of up through international policy. And so I'm curious how you would describe sort of your strategy for reform in psychiatry, given that your background has led you to uncover a lot of deep inequities.
Well, it's interesting. I don't think my strategy or aim has ever been to reform psychiatry. I mean, I've come to the sort of sense that psychiatry reflects a lot of societal views on distress and madness, if you will. And so I'm more interested in those sort of social and cultural and political conditions that inform the kind of ideas behind professions like psychiatry. I have tended towards the human rights agenda in mental health, not because I think that human rights is necessarily an ideal organising principle for all social justice claims. In fact, I have reservations about human rights as an organising principle. I have concerns that it tends to individualise issues by focusing very much on the individual and their, her, his rights, that it is bound up in questionable political agendas over the 20th century, and particularly the kind of driving force of neoclassical liberalism or neoliberalism, and that there are things we lose by pursuing socio-political objectives in legal terms. I think that puts a lot of truck in the law and in courts and in lawyers. However, that said, I do think that the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is an extremely powerful resource for achieving justice in the mental health context. And I think it does something very transformative by drawing what had previously been a narrative that was very much couched in terms of health and illness and pathology into a space where the social model of disability operates. And the social model of disability just very simply and crudely refers to viewing the social and environmental physical conditions as the disabling influence on a person. So people have impairments, various impairments, and that's just part of human diversity. But the disabling force is the interaction between that impairment and the environmental and social barriers to that person participating and flourishing on an equal basis with others. And I think that does something really profound. It draws attention immediately to those conditions. So to answer your question or go back to your question, I think rather than trying to reform psychiatry, it's never been my aim, and I don't think it is today, but I am very interested in drawing attention to those social and environmental conditions in which harm is done and trying to remedy that. And I think the convention provides a really strong frame to address various aspects of that injustice. Sorry, my toddler's coming to rush into my room here. This is part of the joy of being in a city that's effectively in lockdown and having to work from home. So I'm sure listeners and readers will forgive me for that.
Oh, certainly. We're all struggling with our home lives right now, I think, a little bit. So I really hear you about the sense in which, a human rights framework can sort of represent a passing of the buck of responsibility to perhaps to legislators and to courts. But at the same time, right, a lot of the work that you've done highlights the areas in which that framework may be the most potent, right? Like I'm thinking about the work on alternatives to coercion. So would you like to talk a little bit about how you have defined coercion for the purpose of that work? some of the arguments made against coercion at the international level?
Sure, and maybe I'll even go back a step and just address the first point about human rights being a powerful advocacy tool. I mean, it really does carry a strong moral and political weight around the world, in some countries more than others, and in some circles more than others. But I think it does carry strong normative force. And I think what makes the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities unique compared to other areas of international human rights law is that people with disabilities were deeply involved in its negotiation right from the beginning. So you had over 120 different disabled people's organisations and umbrella disabled people's organisations that represented thousands of organisations around the world. And people with experience in the user survivor or the movement of people with psychosocial disabilities, as the terminology goes, were absolutely strategic in those negotiations. And so what you get is a piece of international human rights law that, although described by some as soft law in places like Australia and the US, where there aren't sort of strong regional human rights courts like there are in Europe, it still has a strong normative power in sort of setting agendas and providing a kind of central focus point for broadly agreed upon norms. And so in relation to the second part of your question, well, what's the definition of coercion that I'm using and the basic arguments made against it at the international level? The definition of coercion that we used in our work on alternatives to coercion is a very broad one that referred to both threats and compulsion that I suppose involves physical force. So in other words, the action or practice of persuading in a way that's characterised by the use of force and threats, or forcing someone to do something in the context of mental healthcare provision. So this could occur in nominally voluntary service provision, where someone says, well, you if you don't receive this service or take this intervention, we will force you to do so. But it obviously also occurs in the context of people placed under involuntary commitment or being subject to forced interventions under mental health legislation. The Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities poses a fundamental challenge to that kind of intervention and demands a response that prioritises supported decision-making and broader support to exercise one's legal agency and assert one's kind of personhood as a legal subject, to use some of the terminology. But basically, it's just to say that, these interventions can no longer happen to people simply on the basis of them having a disability, and that any interventions must respect people's human rights and occur on an equal basis with all others. And that's a break from centuries of not just legal and political traditions, but so not just in law and policy, but also in intellectual traditions. Ethicists throughout the 20th century really, in general, had this view that personhood was dependent on someone having some essential human characteristic, and particularly a certain cognitive ability and a certain capacity to reason. So for those who fell outside of this kind of idealized subject, sorry to get philosophical, but they were immediately in trouble because they didn't meet the sort of essential criteria for being a moral person. And I think that starts to explain some of the horrors that you see through the 20th century, where things like the Nuremberg Code, which requires informed consent for any kind of medical experimentation, were just presumed not to apply to people who were diagnosed with a psychiatric condition or mental illness. And equally, there were around 24 international human rights law instruments that were developed through the 20th century, and yet it was just presumed that they could be. There were exceptions that applied to people with particular diagnoses. So I think that intellectual tradition is fundamentally challenged by the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. But of course, it's sitting there at the high heights of international human rights law. And so translating that into practical political change that changes the way mental health services are provided and the laws that are operative in our various countries is something that is a work in progress. I see my work as part of that work in progress, and I think that foundational involvement of persons with disabilities, to use the terminology, but particularly people with experience in mental health services or people who have experienced abuse and feel they have survived those interventions, is absolutely critical at as many different stages of the research as possible, from research design, or particularly research design, but right through to the way that research is conducted and then how it's communicated and so on. So that's, I suppose, what has guided me, and it's allowed me to do some terrific research with some incredible collaborators and people who are sort of real intellectual leaders in the field, people like Kath Roper and Eleanor Flynn, Dr. Anna Arstein-Kerslake and Professor Bernadette McSherry. I mean, and I've been able to meet other leaders around the world, Professor Amita Danda, Professor Jared Quinn, Theresia Degener. Like, there are just such tremendous people. Alberto Vasquez is an incredible force that he's working in Geneva to bring some of the political commitments of the user survivor movement to the heart of kind of international human rights law.
So just staying at the level of the UN for just a moment, I'm curious, given the history that you've described of the sort of contested terrain of personhood, from an intellectual perspective, were there any major disagreements or notable debates in the generation of those recommendations for alternatives to coercion that you think are interesting?
Certainly. I mean, the whole terrain, to use your term, has been characterized by debate and intense disagreement. I mean, some of the key provisions on issues related to issues of coercion in mental health were the subject of vigorous debate during the negotiations, and the negotiators came to something of a negotiated silence, as one of my colleagues, Annegret Kampf, puts it. A negotiated silence whereby everyone was able to agree to the terms, but it wasn't explicitly clear as to whether all kinds of forced intervention in the mental health context ought to be abolished. At least in very formal terms. Looking at the text, it's not clear. And that interpretive silence has caused enormous disagreement about what the convention means in relation to involuntary mental health treatment and interventions. And that's been evident in debates even between major human rights committees within the UN. So even within the UN apparatus, there is major disagreement between human rights treaty bodies, in particular the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and then on the other side, the broader Human Rights Committee. So the Human Rights Committee have said, well, involuntary treatment is okay, subject to the rule of law and opportunities to appeal, and so long as it's in the least restrictive alternative, so more or less what the current arrangement is in most countries that have mental health legislation. The Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, on the other hand, have unambiguously said that all forms of coercive intervention in the mental health context must end and must be abolished. And you've seen that kind of disagreement travel down to the regional level, to the individual country level, right down to, on conference panels and in public forums and in probably the organising rooms of mental health service user organisations and so on. I mean, I've seen that debate play out in the 10 years since I started my PhD in rooms all over the world, and it's been really interesting and it's been a powerful sort of force or platform for conversations about the nature of these kind of interventions, and I suppose that disagreement ended up in something of a deadlock. Which is why the work on alternatives to coercion is so important, because I think on both sides of the debate, there is broad agreement that coercion is used too much, that it is unnecessary in almost all situations if the conditions are right, and that more work needs to be done in order to find ways to avoid its use. I mean, that's simplifying it a lot, but I think that's the crux of it. And so everyone agrees that there is a need to pursue law and policy reforms to reduce and prevent coercion. And by pointing to that body of research, I think that can be a useful political strategy to get everyone moving beyond just incessant disagreement about the foundational idea of whether forced treatment is something that can or cannot be abolished.
Yeah, so there is broad consensus then that psychiatry and mental health settings are pretty reliant on coercion. You would say that that's the case, like there's a solid acknowledgement of the problem and reasonably clear definition in that sense?
I mean, it's just manifestly the case. If you look at public health services, it's typically the case in the kind of high-income countries that I've looked at that about 50%, between 30 and 50% of people in public mental health services, particularly hospital wards, are there in under some kind of involuntary status, according to mental health legislation. So I think it's manifestly the case. I don't think it's a point that even warrants debate. Oh, and then in community services, there's considerable use of forced treatment through mechanisms like community treatment orders or assertive outpatient treatment, so-called, which in countries like Australia and the UK and Canada and the US, I think, accounts from anywhere between sort of 13% or more of community mental health encounters. I think that's going to vary around the world. I think my stats there is from Australia, but I think you'll find similar rates around the world.
Yeah, so that partially answers my next question, which is, I found myself stumbling on the notion of degrading treatment in reading Alternatives to Coercion. Mm-hmm. And it seemed to me that there's kind of a slide, perhaps, where, it's quite recognizable that detention and treatment without consent are operating in contexts when it's often inappropriate and unnecessary. But what about something like degrading treatment? Can you describe what that means?
That relates to a part of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the part of international human rights law related to the Convention Against Torture, which in its full title includes the Convention Against Torture and Cruel, Inhuman and Degrading Treatment. And that part of the Convention Against Torture is often missed. So it's a provision that is bound up in this very heavy notion of torture, which is crucial to some people's framing of these issues. So, for example, Tina Minkowitz has really used that provision as a central part of her understanding of forced treatment and the relevant issues. And it is crucial, and so has the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which has indicated that forced treatment is very much activating provisions in international human rights law regarding cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment. And I think that's just a useful way to think about some of these issues. I mean, I don't know how useful it is to distinguish those particular elements, or what's inhuman compared to what's degrading. There are specialists who would go into that. That's not an area of my expertise, but it is, I think, a crucial part of the conversation.
So zooming back out a little bit then, your sweeping reviews have found that, explicit efforts to prevent or to reduce coercion nearly always provide positive results. So with research and guidance becoming available to service managers and to clinicians, what would you say are the notable blocks to adoption and to implementation?
I think culture is a major block where it would be challenging for many service providers to shift perspectives, and I think that's informed by legislation which may require interventions or may be interpreted to require interventions that are coercive. And then I suppose the political pressure that comes from governments who are playing the risk card and really amplifying risk-based concerns. And I think that issue of risk is a problem more broadly across culture and politics and law. And then I think there are barriers to research agendas and intellectual work that needs to be done to prioritize the reduction of coercion, because although we found a great deal of research that supported interventions being effective in reducing and preventing and even eliminating coercion, we were surprised by the sheer lack of research in this area. And I think that's a really interesting question of why has the reduction in coercion been of so little interest to the broad field of mental health research? Why has it been of so little interest? The important point is to really interrogate that question and draw people's attention to it, and then start to demand research agendas be shaped around this idea of what next? If we are going to take the convention seriously, what next? And we need, in effect, a sort of transitional period in which that movement that you described takes place. And so I think there are many people who could answer that question really productively, and I'm sure you have your ideas about what the blocks are. But one, I think, for me as a researcher is that research agenda, and I've just been shocked by the lack of research that has gone into these questions. So, for example, there was another survey of alternatives to coercion that was done quite recently by Kadui Barbado, and it found that there wasn't a single randomized trial with this aim of reducing coercion in the US since 1999. I think that's astonishing. And I read some of the quotes from the former director of the National Institute of Mental Health, which is arguably the largest mental health research institute in the world, based there in the US, who openly describes the many billions of dollars that went into research into neuroscience and genetic and very highly natural scientific areas of interest that are almost obsessed with the pathophysiological, biological basis for mental health diagnoses. And then that same person openly describes how that research investment didn't result in the needle being shifted in terms of real life change for people who are using services and family members and so on. So I think that is a major blockage when it's not even seen as a priority in the distribution of resources for mental health related research.
It's quite unbelievable. And, I'm tempted to give a psychologizing answer. Like, some of these questions are so grotesque in the recognition of what are common practices that people often don't want to delve that deep. But maybe if I can just prod you a little bit more on this, I wonder if there are any practices that you've written about in recommendations that you're aware might be seen as radical to service providers. Any intuitions there on whether or not, what kind of a leap it might be for service providers to implement some of these in practice?
Well, in our report, I suppose we tried to provide options because none of us who are authoring that report, and I just must make a nod to my colleagues, Professor Bernadette McSherry, Kath Roper and Flick Gray, none of us assumed that there would be any one intervention or program or practice that would magically transition responses to distress and crises overnight into a human rights compliant, wonderful response. I mean, that would be perverse because it would presume some universal solution to what are extremely varied political, social and economic conditions in which these issues play out around the world. So we tried to provide a spectrum of programs and practices and initiatives, some that were in the mental health services and some that were explicitly based outside of mental health services that were sort of peer-run, informal, community-driven processes. But then we also looked at those very formal policy changes like the safe ward strategy and other kinds of interventions. I think in terms of the a particular practice that might be alarming or seen as a radical change for mental health service providers, maybe the open doors policy. So there's been some research in Germany that indicates that wards that had open doors tended to have lower rates of conflict between people who were there in those wards and staff, and had better outcomes on several indicators. And I've heard even privately psychiatrists in my own country who were talking about an instance in their hospital when construction of the hospital meant that they had to have open door policies as a matter of health and safety just for the period of the construction, and that they were surprised by the benefits that came along with that. But I think if you propose that or ordered it of hospitals, it would cause great alarm. And I think it's perhaps for those reasons that I described earlier, the cultural blockage to thinking that anything except some element of coercion is required when it comes to mental health crises, or the legal problems that arise when clinicians and hospital administrators are fearful of liability. And the kind of broader cultural and political pressures from tabloid papers that will seek responsibility if something goes wrong, and usually that lies with the service providers. So I hope we've been able to provide a wide range of options for people so that they can try to identify things that are specific to their circumstances. But I suppose the broader methods that we've proposed of ensuring that these are human rights informed changes, that people with lived experience, ideally of the very services and communities in which these changes are taking place, are there at the very centre of the change initiatives. I think these are the kind of crucial ingredients more than anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. So why don't we switch gears a little bit then to something that has broad sweeping effects both inside of mental health context and also outside. So, for some of us, and I think for myself and for readers of Mad in America, it might be a little bit easier to see the connection between coercion in psychiatry and the ramp up of algorithmic and data-driven technology in mental health care. And this is another area of your focus. And so I'm curious about how you understand this connection. And I'm reminded of the mention of risk and liability avoidance as well in this context.
Sure. Well, I'm a relative newcomer to issues concerning algorithmic and data-driven technologies, things like artificial intelligence, machine learning, and robotics, or other technologies of automation. But I developed a strong interest in this after witnessing, as many other people have, and certainly readers of Mad in America will be aware, the rise of digital technologies in the mental health context. I mean, I've focused on the good, the bad, and the trivial when it comes to digital technologies. And I suppose one of the areas I am interested in is the connection between coercion and some of the algorithmic technologies that are arising. And I think your point about risk is a really important one, because a lot of algorithmic and data-driven technologies are driven by a function to predict outcomes based on mass amounts of data, or predict certain things. So it might be predicting the likelihood that a person is experiencing altered states of consciousness or psychoses, or the likelihood that someone may be harming themselves or intending to suicide, or it might be about predicting the likelihood that a person will experience a diagnosis of depression. I think predictive power is what people see in algorithmic technology as being so useful. But it's interesting with predictive power, because you can predict something, but if the typical responses aren't there, then what's the value of predicting it? That's one of the questions that I'm quite interested in. But to draw it back to coercion and risk, well, I suppose there's a grave potential for algorithmic and data-driven technology to amplify that tendency in our societies to sort of obsess over risk and have it frame our legal and policy responses to distress and emotional crises by further monitoring and observing people in order to prevent these things, particularly if people start making claims about the predictive power of technologies to, say, predict gun violence, as has been the case. I mean, there are stories from Florida in your own country where state powers have been granted to collate information about the mental health service use of students, and then compare that with social media posts and provide that to police in order to ostensibly prevent gun violence. And I think that's a good example of how these kinds of technologies can be drawn into coercive impulses within various state agencies. And I've seen studies into the use of GPS monitoring devices in closed wards and in forensic psychiatric facilities. And in all of those studies, in very few of those studies have the human rights implications been considered, have the issues of dignity and other ethical concerns with the experience of the person and broader societal impact being considered. I just finished a broad survey of studies into the use of algorithmic technology in online mental health initiatives, and we came up with a list of about 128.
Wow.
And only 19 of these studies even considered ethics. And when I say considered, that only means in some cases just having a one-sentence reference to broad ethical issues. In others, there were maybe 2 paragraphs given to it. But that is a serious oversight in the research, and in not a single one of the 128 studies was a person with lived experience of services or an advocacy group involved, even at the level of basic consultation, let alone involvement in conducting the research, in setting the agenda, in disseminating the research. So I think the potential for those technologies to be used in unthinking ways to amplify some of the worst aspects of current mental health service arrangements is very serious indeed.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I am a little dismayed to hear that there were so few studies that made any mention of ethics. Like, I think about the tech industry, and ethics is something that everyone is pretty excited to kind of give a little head nod to, but ultimately brush off, right? Because in very simply profit-driven consumer tech industries, usually ethicists are kind of like the party poopers. Like, mostly what they're doing is putting the brakes on various practices. So it's a little bit surprising for me to hear that data and technical ethics are less on the agenda in the mental health sphere. And I'm curious about what you think specifically are the problems to putting those issues on the agenda in mental health contexts that, sometimes are at least a little bit more sensitive, I would think, to the importance of handling personal information delicately, for example.
Well, I think as a starting point, I should say that there are exceptions to the kind of trend that I pointed to, and there is good research being conducted. I know, examples from the UK and US where, people who are clinicians have really engaged critically with some of these questions and have engaged with people from the broad kind of movement of those with lived experience and peers and so on. But I do see this as a trend, and I suppose it's part of a kind of techno-solutionism in which people view technology as swooping in and solving all of these complex social and political issues as being a serious problem. And I suppose some of the kind of more severe bio-focused traditions in psychiatry could be accused of a similar kind of techno-solutionism, presuming that some pathophysiology merely needs to be addressed via medication in order to resolve what is in fact a complex social and political and personal problem. I think the way to address some of the gaps in thinking about the ethics and the law and the politics of digital technology in the mental health context is to bring in those with lived experience right from the foundational discussions about research agendas through to the conducting of that research. I sound like a broken record, but I do think this is critical. And there are many people in that position who have great knowledge. I mean, I'm currently doing some work as a Mozilla fellow on issues around digital technology in mental health, particularly online. And I've got this incredible advisory group made up of people who are doing tremendous work in this field. Lydia XZ Brown, Leah Harris, James Horton, Jonah Bosowich, Keris Myrick, Kalichi Abuso, and Alberto Vasquez. And I think it's in my discussions with this group, there was a sense that work needs to be done to improve the digital literacy of advocates in the mental health space, but by the same token, not to lose focus on ensuring that big tech companies and some of these other stakeholders who are sort of new to the mental health space, computer scientists in particular, become literate in the politics of mental health and in some of these really pressing issues that have characterized work in mental health policy and law and in responses to distress in the last few decades. But I think trying to promote debate at the moment and draw these issues out of the shadows and into the public is also crucial, because in many ways the technology is at an early stage. And so it becomes difficult to talk about things like the ethics and law because they're being worked out at the moment. I mean, when I talk about law, I'm often talking about social, political issues, and it's perhaps even misguiding to say that I'm focusing on the law. But I think the law can come in once those ethical and social and political issues have been worked out, and once the harms are very clear, or potential harms, at which point you can start talking more fruitfully about regulatory and legal impacts. And I think that is a crucial step to addressing what you describe of ethics being cast aside, or being something that's easy to sign up to, but doesn't really bind anyone to any formal agreements in the same way that regulation and law will.
I really appreciate your pointing to the shared solutionism, perhaps, of medication in psychiatry and, products in the tech industry. And to me, it's of great concern that the sort of move fast and break things ethos of Silicon Valley, would invade the rendering of mental health services online, such that a lot of the anti-coercion work that you do would be, it's like one step forward and two steps back almost,
right,
in the use of a lot of these technologies.
I think that's a really important point, and it's something that those who are more grounded in the politics of mental health or in these issues are going to have to grapple with, because there are new forces at play. There are computer scientists, and this is a sort of intellectual tradition and an area of of sciences that people in the mental health context haven't really had to grapple with. And data science, but then of course those big tech players. So I think that is something that is really going to have to be grappled with in coming years. And I think one useful way to do so is to look toward the broader movement for algorithmic accountability. So I see great potential to bring together, I suppose, the broad movement of peers and persons with disabilities, service users and so on, with the broad movement concerned with algorithmic accountability. And I suppose what I mean by that is the tradition of work concerning internet politics, digital rights, and the kind of force that algorithms and data-driven technology have over our lives, and efforts to ensure that those technologies are subject to good and robust governance. And algorithmic accountability is concerned with not just making sure that those algorithms are explainable, that decisions are subject to being challenged and so on, but also more foundational questions about whether particular technologies ought to be developed for particular purposes at all. And if so, who governs them? And that is a really pressing question, I think, for those who are interested in the politics of mental health.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's difficult for people to grasp. Maybe it has to do with the sort of false binary of, science and humanities, or math and the humanities, is that, right, like the governance of algorithms is basically like who gets to decide how to make meaning of the massive amounts of data that we're able to collect, right? So in a big sense, it connects to the participation of users and survivors with lived experiences of, being intervened upon, right? Is that kind of what you envision?
Well, that's absolutely right. And that's a really interesting way of framing it. I hadn't really thought about governance as meaning making, but it's certainly the case. I mean, not this area of digital mental health technologies, for want of a better term, is an area where knowledge is currently being produced at a relatively early stage. And I think now is the time to intervene in shaping that knowledge. And like you say, who better to inform the meaning that is given to these various initiatives than those with lived experience of using services, and those who have lived experience of distress outside of the use of services. I mean, there are really promising technologies being developed that attempt to, I suppose, bridge the divide that you're describing between the life sciences and the social sciences, or natural and social sciences, and which really draw from people's direct lived experience, people facing addiction, crisis, and people who've developed peer support using online spaces and sort of citizen science principles to organise and come up with new forms of knowledge, and I think there's great potential there for really creative and productive collaborations to make the most of these different forms of technologies.
Absolutely. So thank you so much, Piers, for talking to me today, and I'm so looking forward to seeing more of your work out there in the world.
Oh, you're welcome, Emmeline. I've really enjoyed this conversation, so thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Mad in America podcast. Visit madinamerica.com for more news, views, and updates.